Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Grimes, and I'm the Director of Outreach and Community Relations at NYSARC Trust Services. And we are excited to be discussing part 3 of our 3-part webinar series. So we have our final session today. Part 1, we talked about how to determine which trust program is right for you. In 2, we talked about how you actually set up a trust with NYSARC Trust Services. And now we're going to talk about how you can use the funds in a person's trust account to help provide for things that their benefits don't cover and be able to provide them with a better quality of life. Now, before we jump in, just a few housekeeping items. Everyone is muted. We have a lot of people on the call, so to limit any background noise, we have you all muted. You can chat with us as a host, but you cannot chat with others. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer them as we see them, but we will reserve time at the end of today's discussion to answer any final questions. We have closed captioning enabled, so please turn that on your end if you would like closed captioning. I've already dropped a link in the chat, so if you joined after the first time, I'll copy that in again just now, that you can download the materials from today's training. You'll also receive an email tomorrow with a link to those materials. We are recording today's session, and it will be available on our website within a couple of days following today's session. And you'll be prompted at the end of the webinar to complete a brief survey. Please provide us with some feedback so we can understand how the content was received and other topics that you might want to hear about in the future. Now, just to cover a couple, we've got a lot to cover today, but just going to give you kind of a quick rundown of how the key learning objectives for today's presentation. We're going to start by talking about what are some of the items that the trust can pay for and just basic rules of trust administration that govern what are eligible expenses. We'll give you some examples of some of the things that people commonly use the trust to pay for, and we'll also cover things that are typically not eligible for payment. We'll discuss some of the different types of disbursement requests, who is authorized to submit requests, and we'll talk about the process of making a one-time request versus automatic payments for recurring monthly bills. We'll go through step-by-step how to submit a request for a distribution from the trust, common requests, as well as the documentation requirements for those requests, and how you can track the activity in your trust account and see when something goes out for payment once you've made a request. Now, a supplemental needs trust or a pooled supplemental needs trust is designed to help people with disabilities who typically receive means-tested government benefits or who may need these benefits in the future to help them keep either money in their own bank accounts below the financial limits for programs or money from a third party that would otherwise disqualify them from certain means-tested benefits. These tools allow them to put that money aside in an account that could then be used to pay for items and services that they want or need that will give them a better quality of life by supplementing the services that they receive from government benefit programs. So the trust is typically going to be intended to be used for items and services that are for that person that their government benefits don't cover. That allows us to maximize the services that they receive from government benefits and allow them to qualify without impoverishing themselves to do so, while having the means to give them a better quality of life. Now, each person's situation is going to be unique. What an individual person's trust can pay for will be based on a variety of factors. It can be based on what types of benefits they receive, how old that individual is. We may be able to pay for certain things and may not be able to pay for certain things based on a person's living situation. For example, if they're living in the home of a loved one versus a home that they own. If they live in a residential facility or a nursing home or an assisted living program, or even a HUD housing apartment or Section 8 apartment, right? So that person's living situation can often impact what we can pay for. And depending on the type of trust that you have, a supplemental needs trust, what it can pay for, can be dictated by what's in the trust agreement. So if you have set up your own trust with a private attorney, that trust agreement, one of the benefits of that is that you can actually put in different terms. You have the flexibility to say, this trust is intended to be used for this purpose, where a pooled trust has a master trust agreement. And the things that we can pay for are generally more broad. It's not as specific to, certain expenses, but that is something that can change what is eligible for payment out of a special needs trust. And there can be some variations depending on if the trust is funded by the individual themselves as a first party trust versus a trust being funded by someone other than the individual who's receiving government benefits. Now, the rules about what a trust can pay for are going to vary. And where these rules come from are your state benefit programs. So each benefit program, like Medicaid, supplemental security income, Social Security disability, Section 8 HUD, they're all going to have different rules that will dictate what the trust can and can't pay for. It's also going to be based on federal law. So Social Security Administration has a manual called the Program Operations Manual that we use as a guideline to tell us what the trust can and can't pay for. The rules of how the trust can be used do not come from the trustee and don't come from NYSARC Trust Services typically, unless it's an individual policy of our trust. Most of the rules that govern what a trust can pay for come from state and federal law. The key rule about what the trust can be used for is that it must be for the primary benefit of the individual who's receiving services. We generally don't buy gifts for other people, and the funds in the trust, any item or service that we're purchasing, should be primarily to benefit that person. So again, some purchases might provide ancillary benefits to others, but it should be for that individual. So generally, we're not able to buy gifts for other people with the money. And then there are other examples that we'll talk about throughout today's discussion. We're usually using the trust to buy an item or a service that is for the individual that's going to supplement what they receive from government benefits. It's the trustee's duty to review each request and consider the impact that it could have on a person's financial eligibility for benefits. So there are going to be limitations depending on what type of benefits you receive. For example, supplemental security income benefits. Payments from the trust for what are considered to be in-kind support and maintenance are things that can reduce a person's cash payment from SSI. So generally, we're not going to purchase those things. We're going to want to allow that person to get the full benefit of their cash payment. And we're going to use the trust funds to pay for other things, not food or shelter, as that would potentially reduce someone's SSI. There can be limitations if the person is a minor. If they're under the age of 18, they should still be having their basic needs covered by their parents. And so it would be a limitation of the trust that we would generally not be able to pay for things that are the legal obligation of a parent to provide. And all requests require some form of documentation. And there's a number of reasons for that. We'll talk about that throughout today's discussion. But we need to document how the funds in the trust are being used so that we can report to the appropriate government agencies upon request. Sometimes they need to get a full accounting of the last year. Sometimes they'll come and ask for multiple years, and sometimes they want to look at an individual expense. So it's very important that we're keeping documentation for how the trust funds are being used. And ultimately, it is up to the trustee. The trustee is the individual or the entity that has been entrusted to use these funds appropriately for the benefit of this individual. And so it is ultimately up to the trustee to say yes or no and authorize a particular request. These are always going to be conversations that we have with the family or the individual directly. We're not simply just going to issue a decision without having some conversation and discussion together. And ultimately, if there's something we're not able to pay for, we can almost always identify something else that is eligible for payment from the trust that would allow that person to use funds that they have outside of the trust to make that purchase. For example, to buy gifts for their grandchildren. And payments from the trust can be made as a one-time request, asking us to pay a bill or make a purchase. And they can also be set up as recurring monthly payments for bills that are the same amount each month or expenses that are the same amount each month. Items that are the list of items that we can use the trust for is truly endless. There is so many things that we can use trust funds for to improve the life of an individual. These are a few examples of some of the categories that are common expenses that people use the trust to pay for. But it's ultimately going to be very unique to that person and what they want or need, as well as what benefits they receive. So again, generally it's going to be items and services that are for that person, okay? If someone is using the trust to spend down monthly income in order to qualify for Medicaid, they're generally using that money to pay their monthly expenses every month. So things like their rent or mortgage, property taxes, could also be condo maintenance or just general maintenance on that property that they own, like home repairs, modifications that are going to make that home more accessible, including insurances that you need to maintain that property. I see a few people's hands are raised. I just want to remind everyone is muted. Please put questions into the Q&A if you have a question. We're not able to unmute anyone. And then can also be things like utility bills, food expenses, if you need groceries. We can pay for transportation, whether that's car loan or lease, car insurance, as well as expenses if you don't have a vehicle, public transportation, rideshare services, right? So whatever types of transportation or vehicle expenses that individual might have. When it comes to medical expenses, we're typically only going to be able to pay things that are not covered by other government benefits, right? We want to be sure that that medical bill you receive, it has already been billed to Medicare and billed to Medicaid before the trust may use funds in the trust account to pay off that bill, right? You receive government benefits. We want to make sure you're getting those services and using the trust funds to supplement those benefits. But if there is a medical expense that's not covered, or if you need additional hours of care above and beyond what Medicaid's providing, if you need over-the-counter items that are not covered by your Medicare benefits or other services, those are examples of things the trust would consider for payment. And for those that are using the trust that might have a larger sum of money in their account, someone receiving supplemental security income benefits, or someone who lives in a residential facility who's getting most of their basic needs met on a monthly basis by the benefits they receive, they might be using the trust more for quality of life things, right? Entertainment, recreation, a hobby, maybe going back to school, taking classes to learn a new skill. And it can also be therapy services, companionship care, again, things that go above and beyond what your benefits provide. Another thing that is important to consider is using the trust to pay for funeral expenses, right? Some of the individuals want to be able to use their trust to pay for the cost of their funeral. It's important to know that that can only be done during your lifetime. If the money in your trust is funded by the individual receiving services, it is a first-party trust, and we are required to close the account by federal policy upon the death of that person. And no one can be paid. No one can receive any payment from that trust before Medicaid is repaid for the services that were provided to that person throughout their lifetime. So we can pay funeral expenses, but it must be during the lifetime of that person. It must be before their death. And in order to do that, you can set up an irrevocable pre-need funeral plan with a funeral home. It's not like a burial contract. There's no limit on how much money that you can spend other than up to what's available in your account, of course. And you can set that up and prepay for it under an irrevocable contract, and that's allowable through Medicaid. Now, as I talked about earlier, there are some differences between first and third party trust when it's funded by someone else. And in that case, with funeral expenses, there can be some exceptions at the discretion of the trustee. There are some things that we cannot pay for, okay? Most importantly, we can never give cash out of this account to the individual who receives services, who's known as the trust beneficiary. We can also not put any money into a bank account that has their name on it. Even if it's a joint account that the money in that account is not theirs, just because their name is on the account for Medicaid and SSI purposes, it is considered their money, okay? So what we do is we pay third parties. You ask us to make a payment, we're going to pay that to the landlord to pay your rent or the utility company to pay for your electric bill. We're not going to give money out of this account to the individual to then go pay their own bills, okay? It's really important. If we gave you money out of this account, it would be considered yours, and it could potentially increase your income for your benefit eligibility. We generally don't buy things for other people. It's got to be for your primary benefit. So no gifts, no gift cards. And even one that really trips people up is life insurance, right? Who receives the primary benefit of your life insurance policy? It's the beneficiaries of that policy. When you die, they will receive funds from the payments that you made. And so the trust typically cannot pay for a life insurance policy. Doesn't mean you can't have it, just means you can't use the trust to pay for it. We generally do not pay for items that are covered by government benefits, but there are exceptions to that rule, okay? If for example, someone needs a wheelchair, Medicaid may cover that wheelchair, but there may be a long waiting list, or it may take a significant amount of time for someone to receive that piece of equipment. And if we can document that you've made attempts to get Medicaid to cover it, then the trust may, at the trustee's discretion, authorize payment for that item, okay? And that's just one example. There are many, but generally we want to make sure that you're getting the services you should be from government benefits before we use trust funds to pay for those expenses. We can't pay for food and shelter for someone on SSI. Otherwise, we're going to reduce what they get from SSI. If you're using the trust to spend down monthly income, we can pay rent to your adult daughter, and we can pay rent to your landlord, but we cannot pay rent to your spouse. Paying rent to your spouse is like putting money right back into your household, and it's just like giving the money to the beneficiary. We don't make capital improvements to a property that's not owned by our beneficiary. Again, going back to the primary benefit rule. If the beneficiary is not the owner of that property, they're not going to receive the primary benefit of any improvements to that property. We're not allowed to pay for two properties, right? You can qualify for Medicaid and have a primary residence. We cannot pay for your secondary residence. And this is a personal policy of NYSARC Trust Services, but we do not pay for alcohol, tobacco, firearms, illegal activity, bail, or restitution. The purpose of this trust is to improve the quality of life of the individuals that we serve, and it is our policy not to pay for these things. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have a glass of wine at dinner or, smoke cigarettes if that's what you so choose to do. You just cannot use the funds in the trust to pay for those expenses. And as I spoke about earlier, we cannot, under federal policy, pay for anything after the death of a beneficiary of a first-party trust. And so you want to be sure that you are sending in requests regularly and staying in communication with the trust so that we're aware when someone may not be doing well. We have you submit requests so we can utilize the funds that are in the account to the best of our ability. Now, there's different types of disbursement requests. The most common is asking us to pay a one-time expense where you have a bill or an invoice for a purchase or an expense that you owe, like your rent, or your mortgage, utility bills, could be a loan payment, insurance premiums, subscriptions, streaming services. I mean, again, the list is endless. It's up to your particular needs and what you have that you need to pay for. We can also reimburse someone for making a purchase on behalf of our beneficiary. So because we can't pay the beneficiary back for them going out and buying something for themselves, someone can go out and buy it for them and we could pay that person back. We can't give money to this from this account to the beneficiary. They would simply submit receipts and proof of payment for whatever they bought, groceries, clothing, other store purchases, things like that. Since we can't give money to the individual out of this account, it means that a credit card can be very helpful to someone who has a trust, because they can go out and have the freedom to make purchases as they need and submit the credit card statement with the receipts for the items that you'd like the trust to pay for. Sometimes it's a larger expense, or you want to make sure that you get approval from the trustee before you go out and shell out the money to purchase something. For example, you're buying a computer or a laptop, or you want to make a modification or a repair to your house. Those are going to be things that you're going to want to discuss with the trust before hiring a contractor. Could be for larger items like furniture, or you want to go on a vacation, right? So vacation is something that's going to be very unique. That's something that's going to require quite a bit of discussion with the trust to determine how are you going to get there? Lodging, money while you're on vacation, right? So we have a lot of things that we need to consider when we're sending somebody on vacation. Maybe they need an aide to accompany them, right? That can be something that we'd have to work out, right? So we generally work with a travel agency. We set these things up. And so these are very unique. We encourage you to contact us and provide some form of quote or invoice for what you're asking us to purchase or pay for. A vehicle is another great example. This is something that is going to require some time. These are not our typical requests, right? So please be sure you always contact the trustee first to discuss what may be required for these types of expenses. Now, there are some ways to make using the funds in the trust more efficient for individuals and help to reduce the amount of paperwork that you need to send to the trust. Now, a lot of these are applicable to someone who's using the trust for monthly bills and a monthly spend down for income purposes, but it can certainly apply in some cases to those that have a larger lump sum. First, we usually look to try and automate what we can, right? If you can send us one automatic payment request and we can pay that bill every month, and you only need to update us when there's a change, that can help automate this process for you and allow you more flexibility with the money you have outside the trust to pay your other expenses. You want to submit requests to us immediately and regularly. You don't want to wait or hold on to a bill, because if something were to happen to that person and that trust account closed, we would no longer be able to pay for that expense. So if you have something you want the trust to pay, send it to the trust as soon as you have the documentation. When you're trying to decide what bills you might use the trust to pay for, you want to take a look at the due dates of those bills based on when you're going to have funds available in your account. If you're using the trust to monthly deposit your income, we have to wait until we receive your deposit. And then there's usually a few days until that money is available, because we need to make sure that that money clears and that you actually have the funds to pay that expense. So when you're looking at what bills you might choose to use a trust to pay for, consider when those bills are due so we can ensure that payments are made in a timely manner. Download your bills online. Don't wait for the paper statement to come in the mail. Sometimes by the time the paper statement comes, we have a very short window of time to pay that bill, right? So as much to the extent that you can, utilize the services that are available to get copies of those bills and send them to the trust as quickly as possible. If you have a spend down for Medicaid purposes, take a look at what your spend down is and select a few larger bills, again, ideally something that could be automated, and send those same bills to the trust every month. It's going to really complicate things if every single month you're trying to decide a different bill you want to use the trust to pay for, right? Now, again, everybody's situation is different. If you have a large lump sum of money in your account, you might not be as concerned about these things. You may not be sending regular recurring bills. You might not even use your trust every month. You might be using it once a year or every couple of years because you're trying to preserve that money for larger expenses in the future, or because you just want the funds to last as long as possible. So every person is going to be unique. Certain vendors we can pay electronically rather than mailing a paper check. So that's important to consider. Choose vendors that could be paid electronically, and we'll be able to potentially pay the bill more quickly. And if you have a lot of bills that are automated, then automate them on your credit card. Instead of sending us your cable bill, your electric bill, and your cell phone bill every single month, have them all paid on your credit card so that you know those are being paid on time. And once a month, send us your credit card statement with each of those expenses outlined on that bill, right? So instead of sending 3 separate requests, you're sending 1 every month, right? So just ways to make this process easier. And it's important to consider that if the bill is due on the 1st of the month and your money doesn't get to the trust until the 4th, meaning that it's not even available for disbursement until the 8th, we'll never be able to pay that bill on the 1st. So what we do is we often try and get a month ahead. So what we're doing is we're paying that bill at the end of every month for the next month, okay? So when you are getting set up to use the trust, we encourage you to contact our office. These are the types of things that we will help you navigate. We can look at what bills you have and help you determine which things are most appropriate to send to the trust. Here are a few examples we'll run through before we talk about the process of how you submit requests to the trust to request payment. So we have Gladys. She's 74 and she's using Medicaid services. Her income was too high to qualify, and so she has a spend down each month where she's either required to pay that money to Medicaid to contribute towards the cost of her care or put the money into a pooled trust. If she gives it to Medicaid, she's not going to be able to afford her monthly expenses. By depositing the money into the pooled trust, after deducting a monthly fee for the trust services, she will have approximately $1,578 a month left to pay for her bills. Now, again, this is not the only money Gladys has to pay bills. She also has money that she's able to keep, right? She doesn't have to send all of her income to the trust, only the amount that she's over the Medicaid limit. So between the money she has outside of the trust and what she has in her trust account each month is what she's going to use to pay her monthly bills. Gladys lives with her daughter, Jane, right? So she has limited living expenses. We're only going to pay a portion of any sort of utility bills, only Gladys's portion that she owes, right? But it allows her to contribute towards the cost of these household expenses when she's living with her daughter and possibly even her daughter's family, right? So we look at things like we'll pay a portion of the utility bill. We can pay her cell phone bill because that's unique to her. And she has cable and internet there as well that she's using. So we'll pay her portion of that also. After paying bills, she might have other things she needs throughout the month. So she'll use a credit card and she'll buy things like her groceries, over-the-counter items that aren't covered by her Medicaid or Medicare benefits. When Jane's not home and she's at work, she's not able to drive her places. She uses the trust to pay for things like rideshare services, or she uses the trust to buy bus tickets so that she can get around and go and do things throughout the day. And other types of personal needs she might have throughout the month, paying for her Life Alert, other subscription services she might have, haircuts, things like that, right? Now, she can send us these as individual bills and submit her credit card statement each month. Or, as I spoke about earlier, there are ways to make this more efficient. One of the easiest things would be, instead of paying her portion of these bills, she could have Jane set up a lease, and we could pay rent to Jane for her cost of living there. She would outline in that lease cost of room and board, her portion of utility bills, even potentially her portion of the grocery expenses. And that way, instead of having to hold on to itemized receipts for the groceries every month, we just pay a set amount to Jane each month for rent, and then Jane uses that money to help contribute towards her cost of these expenses. Another thing, as we spoke about, is if these bills are in Gladys's name, She could have them automated on her credit card. So that would also reduce the number of requests she needs to send in each month. So David is 86. He's also getting Medicaid. He has a spend down as well, but his situation is a little bit different. He's not living with a loved one. He lives at home with his wife, Mary. They own their property and they still owe a mortgage on that property. His spend down each month is over $3,000. And after deducting out the cost of the trust services, he'll have a little over $2,800 a month to pay his bills. So again, we're going to look to pick bills that are going to be the same amount every month, something we can automate to allow Mary to spend more time helping David and providing care and making sure that his needs are met. So we're going to automate the mortgage. And there's other things that he might need the trust for. I mean, he's going to have maintenance on his property that he may need throughout the year. He's eventually going to have to pay property taxes, even personal income taxes potentially. He'll have utility bills and other expenses. He might want to use the trust to pay for landscaping at the house. And even if something's wrong with the roof at some point, he might need to pay for a roof repair. Okay. So we're going to take the primary thing you're going to use the trust for is the mortgage. And then the funds that are left over after paying the mortgage can be used to satisfy these other expenses, or can build up over time to be paid for a larger expense in the future, allowing him to generate an emergency fund for that roof repair or pay his property taxes when those come due. Now, Happy's situation is a little bit different. He's not using the trust for a spend down. He has Medicaid, but his Social Security disability income is lower than the Medicaid limit. So he doesn't have a spend down, but he is receiving a large lump sum from the proceeds from a personal injury settlement. He lives independently in his own apartment. And because he's getting funds from Social Security disability income, he's generally going to be using that money to cover his basic living needs. And we're going to use the funds in the trust to help supplement what other expenses he has and help to provide for the things that he needs throughout his lifetime. So these are going to be things like personal items and services that he needs that his government benefits don't provide. Could be adaptive equipment. If he has a medical expense that's not covered by some of those benefits, we may be using the trust to pay for those types of things. Maybe there's some therapy services that aren't covered by government benefits. And then we can also pay for other sorts of bills, expenses that he has that his SSDI income is not able to cover, right? For Happy, his van is very important to him. It's how he's able to get around. So we might be helping to pay that cost of his van, gas, maintenance, insurance, those types of things, right? So again, each person is going to be very unique to their wants and needs. Robert is on Medicaid, but he also gets supplemental security income benefits, which means that we generally don't pay for food and housing unless if we did, it would reduce what he gets from SSI. He lives in a residential facility, so most of his basic needs are being met. His waiver services and his SSI benefits are helping to provide food and shelter. His lump sum inheritance that he receives is then intended to be used to pay for things that supplement those benefits, to give him a better quality of life and allow him to do things that he would not otherwise be able to do if he didn't have this money available to him. So again, it can be uncovered medical expenses. It can be things that his benefits are not providing, but it can also be things that are purely life enhancing, music therapy, going to see a concert. Maybe he wants to attend summer camp every year, go on vacation, pursue new hobbies like riding a horse, or whatever is personal to that individual. Robert really likes his art classes, and so maybe he's going on Amazon and buying art supplies, and the trust is going to pay for those expenses, right? So again, the list is endless, and it's ultimately up to Robert and what he wants or needs. And we also have to consider how much money we have available and the fact that Robert's 35 years old. So we want to help this money last as long as we can so it can provide a benefit to him throughout his lifetime. So we're typically not going to spend down all of that money in a couple of years, right? We want to allow the money to be spread out throughout his lifetime and be able to purchase things well beyond just a few years. Now, when you have determined something that you'd like the trust to pay for, it's important to understand how you make that request and who can make that request, right? So requests can be submitted by the beneficiary, who is the person receiving services. And in a lot of cases, our beneficiaries are managing their own accounts. It can also be their liaison. In some cases, we have beneficiaries that need someone to be the primary contact for their account and communicate with NYSARC about the things that the person wants or needs. So it can be a beneficiary, their liaison, or anyone who they authorize on their account to submit requests on their behalf. When you complete the joinder agreement to join NYSARC Trust Services, you will give us the names of people who are authorized to submit requests on your behalf. And you can add or remove contacts as needed simply by contacting the customer service department. The only people who can add and remove contacts are individuals who are already authorized on the account. There are some basic rules about what is required in order to submit a disbursement request. Okay, so these are kind of at a minimum, each request must meet this criteria. It's got to be for the primary benefit of the person who is receiving government benefits and is the trust beneficiary. We're going to need to see a bill in that beneficiary's name or some form of proof that that service or item is for our beneficiary. Every request requires some form of supporting documentation. Unless we already have the documentation on file, that would be one exception. And payments are typically made to third parties only. Right? We're going to pay the landlord for your rent. We're going to pay the adult daughter for your groceries that she bought on your behalf. And generally, the expense should be after the trust was opened, and it must be incurred within the last 90 days. And the reason for that is that we generally no longer have the documentation if it's beyond that, right? There are exceptions to that rule, but generally we pay for things that were within the last 90 days. And you should submit your request with plenty of time for the request to be processed. You have to consider the fact that you might have missed something and there might need to be follow-up where we have to get more documentation. You might have not provided all the information we need, and there may need to be time for us to be able to contact you and get more information. And if the expense is being paid by a paper check, you have to be allowing enough time for that check to arrive in the mail before the due date. So we generally recommend that you submit disbursement requests 14 days before they are due. That allows us that time in case there needs to be follow-up and to make sure that the payment arrives in time. Another important consideration is whether or not there's enough money available in the account to pay for this particular expense. You can track what the balance in your account is 24/7 using our online portal. You can call our customer service line and listen to a recording of your recent transactions 24/7. And you can contact customer service directly from 8:30 to 5 on weekdays, and they can give you an update on what is available in the account. If you're using the trust to make monthly deposits and you're set up for electronic deposit, we need to make sure that that money clears before that money will be eligible for disbursement from the trust. So if your electronic deposit is scheduled for the 1st of the month, the first day that money would be available would be the 4th. And here on the screen is the number for the automated system if you have questions about what's available. When it's time to submit your request, you want to make sure you have the appropriate form, either a disbursement request form or an automatic payment application. And that form must be signed by an authorized individual. You attach a copy of the documentation that's needed, a bill, receipt, invoice, or other form of proof of payment, and submit all of that information to NYSARC either by email, fax, or mail. So step 1, we're going to complete and sign the appropriate request form. Disbursement request forms are specific to the individual. And as you can see on the screen here, they have a barcode with your unique account number. So those are not available for download from our website because they're unique to you. They will be provided to you in your welcome packet upon the account acceptance, and they can also be downloaded from the online portal. Automatic payment applications are available for download on the portal as well as our website because those are not specific to the individual. They're a general form. And if you need a copy of these forms and you don't have a printer at home, you can call customer service and we'll have them sent to you. When you're completing a disbursement request form, make sure you complete an individual form for each of your requests. Every request has a different payment address, right? And a different payee and a different amount. So you're going to fill out one request for each disbursement that you're asking the trust to pay. You want to make sure you complete all of the fields on that form. Go back here to you got the date of the request, who is requesting it, how much it's for, what you're asking us to pay, who should that check be made payable to, where does the check need to be sent, and you need to have an authorized individual sign. Today's date is the date you're going to put on that request, right? You're requesting it today. The amount you're requesting should be the total amount that you're asking the trust to pay. So for example, if you're asking the trust for a reimbursement, right? Adult daughter went out, bought groceries, clothing, and over-the-counter items for her mom. She's going to attach all of the receipts and proof of payment for that request, and she's going to add up all of them into one total, the total amount that she's asking to be repaid for those expenses. Please note any sort of special handling on the form. So if you're asking us to send the payment to an address other than what's listed on the bill, things like that, you want to make sure that you note that on your request form. There are some points that you need to attest to. As you are authorizing this bill to be paid, you must sign off that it is for that person's benefit. And there are a number of other attestations there. Review that section and sign the form. If someone does not sign the form, it will delay processing. For automatic payment requests, the expense must be the same amount each month, okay? Because if the bill fluctuates even by only a couple of pennies, we would only be paying the amount that you authorized, right? So we generally are going to be paying most expenses that are the same amount each month. So these are going to be typically things like rent, mortgage, can be car loans, lease payments. Some insurances can be the same amount each month. Electric bill on balance billing. These are some of the things that are most common. But if you have a bill that's the same amount each month, send it in and the trust will consider that for an automatic payment. On the automatic payment form, you will select the date that you want the trust to process that payment. So we are going to send the check out on the day that you choose, or the next business day, if that particular day in 1 month falls on a weekend or holiday. So that's something to be considering when you think about when does that payment need to make it to that vendor. Going back to the example of rent from earlier, if you need the payment to arrive by the 1st of the month, it won't be paid on time if you select the 8th, right? So that's where we might have to get a month ahead. Documentation you submit must indicate the address that we remit payment to. And that can change from time to time. So once you set up the automatic payment, please make sure you're still reviewing each statement that you get on a month-to-month basis and report any changes to the trust as soon as you can. So we want to make sure the payments are getting where they should be. Payment addresses can change, especially if it's a landlord and that particular property is owned by a larger corporation that might be changing hands, okay? And you can always make changes to your automatic payment, whether it's the amount or the payment address or where payments are going. And you can stop a payment as needed by simply filling out the automatic payment application, requesting a change or a stop to your automatic payment. Just give us enough time to process that request. We typically ask you to submit applications for auto pay changes or a new auto pay at least 3 weeks in advance. because again, we're processing many people's requests. It's a first in, first out. So get it to us as early as possible. If you send it to us 2 days before it's due, it's unlikely that we'll be able to set up the automatic payment for that month. But what we would do is we would typically make a manual payment and then set up the automatic payments to begin the following month. And just like any disbursement request, if there's any sort of special handling, please note that on the form. Now, this is unique to individuals who are making monthly deposits into the trust, but it's important to cover. So if you are using the trust for an income spend down, the payment date that you choose for your automatic payment to go out must be 4 days after we get your electronic deposit. Just like what we spoke about earlier, when your deposit comes in, we need 4 days for those funds to clear before they're eligible for disbursement. So if your check comes in or your deposit comes in on the 1st, the earliest we can make payments would be the 4th. If your deposit comes in on the 4th, the earliest we can make payments is the 8th, and so on and so on. The maximum amount that we can pay is going to be the total amount of your deposit minus the cost of your monthly administrative fee, less $10. And that allows the trust to reserve funds to pay the monthly bank fees that are due at the end of each month and typically amount to $1 and change or a couple of dollars, depending on how much money you're keeping in the account. And there's also going to be an annual tax and audit that comes out every year in July. And so we want to make sure that there's money available to pay that expense so that we don't need to reduce your automatic payment that month or ask you to deposit more money. So again, this is only for people who are making monthly deposits into the trust. If you have a larger lump sum in your account, you have more flexibility. So talk about some examples. Your deposit date is the 4th. The earliest we're going to be able to set up your automatic payment would be the 8th. If you have a monthly spend down of $3,000, the maximum amount we can pay on automatic payment is going to be $2,810. This is your $3,000 deposit minus the monthly administrative fee for the cost of the trust to administer the account and pay your bills, minus $10, right? We're reserving that extra $10 each month. It stays in your account. It is not a fee, and it is there so that you have money to pay your bank fees and your annual tax and audit fee. Now, if your rent plus your car payment plus your electric bill is less than $2,810, you're all set. We can pay all of those bills and automate all of them. But if your rent and your car payment, electric bill are above that amount, then you're going to either need to choose which bills you want to automate or deposit more money into the trust. Same thing if you want us to pay your rent and the rent exceeds the maximum amount that you can set up on auto pay. Your options are to have the trust pay a partial payment towards your rent or just deposit more money into the trust so we can pay the full amount of the rent. The next step after you've completed the forms is to attach the documentation for this request. A bill, an invoice should indicate that the item or service is for that person. Could be your rental agreement, your loan agreement, if you're asking us to pay rent or mortgage. If your property is in a trust or your property is in a life estate because you have done some Medicaid planning with an attorney and you want to protect your home from a Medicaid lien in the future, that documentation is needed for us to make any payments towards property expenses. So in addition to getting us your mortgage or other bills or expenses you're asking the trust to pay, we need to see a copy of the trust agreement or the life estate. Credit card statement with itemized receipts. For a reimbursement, we're going to need proof that you made that payment and itemized receipts. So for example, if you bought groceries with cash, the receipt's all we need. It'll say right on the receipt that you paid cash for it. But if you used your debit card, get us your bank statement that shows that you paid that expense along with the receipts. And then service contracts, quotes for things that you'd like to buy, purchase orders if you're asking us to make a purchase on your behalf. The list of and required documents are outlined in our information and procedures document, so you can refer there for common expenses. And if you ever have questions about what's required, contact customer service. Each request must have some form of documentation. We need these bills or the documents in order to report to government agencies if we're asked to show proof of what we use the trust to pay for. We may need to even report to residual beneficiaries, right? So if when the trust account closes and there are people who will be receiving money out of that trust, they may ask us for an accounting. So we need to have copies of what we use the trust to pay for. Reviewing this documentation also allows us to learn our beneficiaries' spending habits, get to know what they use their trust to pay for, what their general expenses are, and to ensure that the funds are being used for things that are for that person. If we're paying for groceries every month for someone and all of a sudden they send us a bill and there are really odd things on that receipt that we don't usually see, and we see that they're spending a lot more than they usually do, that's going to alert us that there may be someone who's trying to take advantage of that person, someone that may be trying to get money out of a person's trust account. So this is really important that we collect this documentation, not just for reporting to government agencies, but to help us make sure that the funds are being used for the individual and that we're making distributions that are appropriate and wise for our beneficiary. If you have questions, refer to the information and procedures for the trust that you are using and contact customer service if you ever have questions. When you submit documentation to us, be mindful of double-sided pages. If you are scanning documents and you don't scan both sides of that bill, we may only receive every other page. Make sure you capture the entire document, including all four corners. We need to see the full document and be able to read it in focus, free of any sort of reflections or glare. So if you are scanning documents or taking pictures with your cell phone, make sure that it is clear and we'll be able to see it, because if it's incomplete or there's any sort of obstructions or we can't make out what it says because it's too blurry or too dark or even too light, then we're going to need you to send another copy, and that's going to delay the processing. And don't upload any documents or photos other than what is required, right? That's just going to slow things down. Send us at a minimum what is required to make that payment. If you do not follow these guidelines, it can delay the processing time. Now, we're going to just review quickly what we've covered. What are the steps of what a trust can pay for? We want to make sure first it is for the primary benefit of the beneficiary. There's enough money in the account to pay the expense, or if there's not, we certainly can just note, partial payment, pay what's available. You've completed a request form or an automatic payment, and that's been signed by someone who's authorized to make disbursement requests on this account. You attach the supporting documentation, invoice, bill, receipt, typically in the beneficiary's name. Include any additional documentation that may be needed, okay? Like I said, if it's a property expense and your house is in a trust, we need to see that trust document as well. And then submit the form with the documents to NYSARC for review. You can email these documents to trustrequest@nysarc.org. You can fax them, mail them. And right now we are currently pilot testing the ability to upload your disbursement request through the online portal. We have a select number of beneficiaries who are helping us test that feature, and we are hopeful that that will be available as early as the beginning of next year to all of our beneficiaries, allowing you to fill out these forms online, upload the documentation, and send it directly to NYSARC for review. Once NYSARC receives your request, we'll typically review and process it in about 3 to 5 business days. Of course, with exceptions for larger expenses like purchases of vehicles and vacations and things like that that might take a little bit more time. Okay, and that's when we're going to remit payment to the vendor. So you also need to make sure that there is time for that to arrive if it's being sent by a check or an electronic payment. And then you can track the request and the status of that request using our online portal. You can wait about 1 to 2 business days and it should appear on the request tab where you can see that we received the request and that it's in process. You can also call customer service to verify that it was received. And then you'll see it appear on the disbursements tab when it is paid. If you're setting up an automatic payment request, you'll see it on the auto pay tab, okay? And you can also call customer service and press 8 for the automated system to get updates on the status of your requests. Now we're going to open things up to questions, but before we do that, and I see we have a lot of them, I just want to remind everybody that we have our final monthly webinar of this year next month on Tuesday. So we usually do host these webinars on Thursdays, but Thursday wasn't available for next month. So we are hosting our next webinar on Tuesday, December 12th, same time, 11 to 12. About pooled income trusts. So this is going to be a very focused training on using a pooled income trust and how to qualify for Medicaid services by spending down income in a trust. We'll cover some of the basics as well as best practices to use your pooled income trust.